my man, Young Flame, is here, taking over the show, taking Berkey's seat. Berkey's gone.
Berkey's gone. Yeah,
he's fired.
Yeah, we got rid of him.
I don't know why it seems to always be this way. Every time, the two occasions lately that I've actually planned something for after I finish playing, both times I final table something, but I'm glad we got to do this.
No, I think that we should book this at least once a week so that you can final table something once a week.
That would be great. If it worked that way, I would happily do that. But I don't know. I think
it does work that way. Don't you understand science?
Yeah, I guess I don't. I guess I don't. Maybe I've just run bad throughout my career, and I haven't got the run good in those spots that I should do.
So which tournament did you final table and what place did you get? Tell us everything.
I got second. It was just a small one on WSOP.com, so wasn't a big one, just like a $20 buy-in thing, but it was a nice little score, so I'm happy.
Nice. Well, congrats.
Thank you.
So quite a day today. Elon Musk said that pyramids are made by aliens. Donald Trump's trying to delay the election. Elon just tweeted that, by the way.
Wow. I did not hear that. I've had Twitter open like half the day. I think I might have muted him after some other ridiculous thing he said recently.
He's losing his mind. Kanye's lost his mind. Trump's lost his mind. We're
all going a bit crazy right now. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird time to be alive.
So how are you doing?
Doing pretty well, actually. Yeah, it's amid all the craziness of lately, I think I'm actually holding up reasonably well. So yeah, not feeling too bad. How about you?
I don't know. I feel like I don't know how to describe how I feel. I feel overwhelmed with no ending to the way I feel. I feel like poker Twitter has become a clusterfuck. I feel like politics has become insane. I don't even believe what is going on. It feels like we're in some sort of dystopian future that someone wrote in 1952 and we're characters in a book. And I can't grasp the reality of the situation right now. I feel like there's no end in sight. I feel overwhelmed in every part of my life. And I don't know how to explain it. I feel like I'm almost having anxiety problems because of all of this. I haven't been very active on social media, and I haven't felt very funny lately either. I felt like sometimes I can crack some good jokes on Twitter and I just nothing is coming my way.
It's hard to be funny right now because all the humor that comes to mind is all really dark humor, and sometimes everyone wants some just genuine, nice, harmless humor, So at a time like this, it's hard not to be cracking jokes that are, related to something that no one wants to think about, So it's a hard time.
And everything's so triggering,
Right.
And I feel like I'm being triggered so easily. And I actually I have a girlfriend who's a therapist, and I reached out to her and I was like, I can feel my anxiety rising just because of COVID and social distancing, and everything is just upside down for me. And so she has me doing an anxiety journal. So when my anxiety starts, I have to start writing down, because it's a little bit of a rational thought with the anxiety, start writing down everything that I'm thinking and then logically break it down, because I feel like primarily I'm a logical thinker, but then my anxiety kind of triggers that fight or flight kind of circular thinking. So I'm trying to be open about that.
That's good. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's been very much the same experience with anxiety as well. I try to be logical, but then you have this thing in your brain that injects this very strong reaction to something and blows it out of proportion. And it's tough to keep it under wraps or to keep it under control without having a systematic way to break it down and say, okay, this is what my brain is doing right now. This is what it's trying to tell me, and this is why. And if I can take a step back from that, then I can sort of tame it a little bit. You can't necessarily master it, but you can kind of keep it in a little bubble where it doesn't hurt you too much.
Yeah, for me, if I write it down, I can see it and I'm like, oh, it's completely illogical. It kind of, you know what it feels like? You know when you first date someone and like it's that first, like someone you really like, not a crappy Tinder date, but like a real date. And like that first like little while we were like, do they like me? Do they not? Are they gonna call me? Or what do they do? Are they gonna ask me out? And it's like this constant like overthinking of the entire situation. I don't know. I feel like I do that. And it kind of feels like that constantly. Like, what's going on? Is the president going to fuck us all over even worse? Is the election going to be delayed? Elon Musk is losing his mind. Kanye West is going to be president. Like, I just, too much, but yeah.
Yeah, like you get this feeling, especially, I don't know if you feel the same way about living on Pacific time, but I've always felt since I moved here that like stuff happens before you get up in the morning. Like, you know, like you, because everything's happening on Eastern time or it's happening in Europe or it's happening everywhere else. Like you get up in the morning and a bunch of shit has already happened that day. If you get up at like, even if you get up like 7 a.m., it's already happening. So it's entirely plausible when you live on Pacific time that you can wake up and Trump has already done some ridiculous thing by the time you get up in the morning. So it's not out of the question that we could wake up and it's like he's announced some crazy thing that is completely like you would have thought it would be impossible, but he's just said that it's a thing. And now we have to try to work out if that's real or not, you know, like. When he
retweeted those guys in the golf cart that said white power, I was like, this is a troll account. This can't be real. But it wasn't a troll account and it is real. And I just, you know what? So in Europe, I have this feeling that if in Europe a prime minister or a president did that, they'd be fucking out. People would rampage. Like in Canada, people would probably like run down the Parliament building and like and drag him out, you know, by his heels. Like this is unbelievable that we didn't fucking say this is our president. And he retweeted a white racist, and
And he's done that. The thing is that he's done that so many times. It's not just that one video with white power. That's like the worst egregious example of it. But the amount of shit that he's done where he's retweeted some weird conspiracy theory that happens to come from an account that is actually a white supremacist account.
Yeah.
He's done that so many times, for going back to like 2017. And if someone had called him out the first time and said, hey, this is completely unacceptable, and actually like address that as the massive issue that it is, that he's either he's thinks it's fine or he's not looking at who's tweeting the stuff that he's retweeting. He
thinks it's fine. I'll just tell you.
Of course. I mean,
it's not a random it's not a random oopsie where every other tweet was like an Obama level of thoughtfulness. It fucking happened on purpose. I don't care what anyone says. Any other job he had in the United States right now, he'd be fired.
Yeah, 100%. And
people are still going to vote for him.
And if he was in any position of responsibility, certainly in I'm glad that you're European and you can like look at it through that European lens, because this is the way I look at it. It's like in the majority of the democratic world, the West, basically, right? The countries that we look at as like they have a broadly similar democratic structure to what the US has, mostly. Some of them are parliamentary, some of them still have monarchies, but the monarch doesn't actually do anything. And broadly, they're kind of similar. If you look at how those countries work, they would not have tolerated one day of what Trump has done as president. They literally would have turfed him out of there so quickly because he's so completely, obviously incompetent at the actual mechanics of the job. As soon as it became evident that he just had no basic idea of like what the amendments in the Constitution were or any of this type of stuff, the rudimentary stuff that you would think is like the absolute lowest requirement for being president of the most powerful country on the planet. As soon as that became obvious, 50 people within the government would have said, this is ridiculous, we've got to get him out of there. And they would have gotten him out of there and it would have worked. And they would have actually put someone in who maybe was still a pretty bad candidate, but at least had the basic functionality down. But for whatever reason, the Republican Party didn't have the ability at some point to say, hey, you know what, maybe we would be better off if we actually just like took any random generic Republican, if we just took fucking Mitt Romney or somebody and just said, hey, look, let's just dump Trump and have any generic other guy that can kind of know what he's doing in place. It is insane to me that they've committed so heavily to this idea that if they dump Trump, they think they'll be losing all their voters. And that it doesn't make any sense to me, because if they're this committed to him that they are willing to go this far and to allow him to like put them in a position where they may not get if and when they lose this election, which they likely will, they may not win another one for a very long time if they're not really careful about how they manage like getting away from Trumpism. Because the younger generations in this country, they're not getting any more right wing. Like nobody's out there like trending to the right in the way that they're seeing the country evolving, right? So you look at like the generation of the Parkland kids and things like that. That generation is going to grow up thinking, I am never going to vote Republican as long as I live, no matter what they do, because they associate it with Trumpism. And the errors that they're making now are going to compromise their strategy for decades, possibly. And yet, if they had just said after 6 months, when it kind of became obvious that he was doing a lot of like really shady stuff that related to Russia, where like he refused to criticize Putin and he was like revealing classified information to the Russian ambassador in meetings and shit like that. If they had just said, you know what, let's nip this in the bud before it gets really bad, and let's just have Mike Pence be president, and we'll just like take a bit of a hit and possibly lose 2020, but at least in the long term, we'll be okay. If they'd done that, we'd all be kind of annoyed right now, but we'd be fine. But instead, they chose this route of going, like, metaphorically going all in on, like, the worst guy to do this job. And I just don't get it at all.
What about the thought of that? Okay, so I want to, like, point to religion for a minute. If you look at, like, highly religious countries, people are, you know, let's say like Saudi Arabia, where women just got to drive and women have to have a man with them when they go in public and stuff.
Yeah.
And then we have like moderates here, and like Christopher Hitchens used to always say, like, no, the true religion is actually the way it is practiced in Saudi Arabia, where the moderate version is not it. Like Christianity, if you want to really practice Christianity, you got to stone someone for, you know, having adultery. So do you think that the people who are still voting for him, or that base, like that is the true version of the Republican Party?
The way I see it is there's a, like coming from a language background and with the stuff that I studied, I don't mean this in like a bragging sense, but for my master's degree, I did a lot of work on nationalism and social identity and how migration affects it and things like that. And there's a narrative that exists in America where religion is partly tied up in it, but the narrative itself is the way I see it, the narrative is bigger than that, in that the religion and then a lot of ideas that relate to the way people like this American dream concept, and a lot of ideas wrapped up in business and capitalism and money and things like that. They all tie together into this big narrative that the Republican Party invested in very heavily at a certain point. And a lot of it was Reagan, from what I can tell. A lot of it was like Reagan really building up this narrative that people attracted to. And religion was part of that, it seems, but I don't think it was the thing that governed everything else. I think it was a combination of all these different things that allowed people to really attach to this idea. But the problem is that as time's gone further and further by, that idea has become elevated above everything else to the point where the actual reality of what goes on in this country has been just completely bypassed by everybody that has bought into that idea. So the idea that, sorry, go ahead. I could see you.
No, I wanted to ask you to just clarify what you mean by the idea.
Okay, I guess what I mean is the concept of American national identity that causes that feeling of wanting to wave the flag everywhere and wanting to show everybody that America is the greatest country in the world, right? Because the funny thing about it is that all countries have national identity. All countries have a sense of nationalism, a sense of pride. But in my experience, and I've lived in 11 different countries, so I've had enough experience to kind of make an opinion on this, is America, there's no other country that so is forcefully is willing to say we're the best country in the world than America is. like, I don't know if you experienced this growing up in Poland. I don't know if there were people saying Poland is the best country in the world.
Yeah, no,
But,
I grew up in Poland and Canada, and I did not notice the same thing. I noticed in it. I mean, I spent most summers in Poland, and you know, I was young when I left, and then most of my life in Canada. But like, if there's a pandemic, it seems like people are compliant. Like, look, we don't want to spread it. We're science based. You know, we're rational. But here, everything revolves around individual rights, and that is greater than science. And to me, it seems weird. It's like a very entry level point of thinking about it, because really it has nothing to do with your rights. Wearing a mask has nothing to do with your rights. I mean, it's almost libertarian, right? Because you let everybody do what they want. You can you don't have to wear your mask at home, but you can't hurt anyone else. That's kind of like that libertarian idealist kind of thing. Like, you do what you want, just don't hurt anyone else when you're doing it. And that's the same thing. Like, you want to wear the mask to not hurt anyone else. You got to keep your spit in your mouth.
Right. Yeah. And I think I think you kind of nailed it there, in the sense that a big part of that, the ideology of that has emerged over the past sort of 30, 40 years in this country, is the idea that, as opposed to the American collective, this ideology is kind of unique among sort of national ideologies, in that it is all about the individual. Like, the idea of the empowerment of the individual is something that doesn't crop up too much in other countries.
But so this empowerment of the individual, and I love America. I love living here.
Yeah,
I love the Silicon Valley, you know, the tech that's out here. And what I love about Silicon Valley is like the embracing of failure, and that, you know, people are happy to fail here and know that it's like it's like a notch on your belt. Like, you failed and you learned from it and you moved forward. And a lot of very successful people out here have failed, where that's not a thing in other countries. Like, there's like no failure in a communist country. Like, that's why Russia came out with those shit cars during communism, because like, you don't have time to conceptualize things. You don't have time to test and innovate. You just got to meet your deadlines, and it doesn't matter how. And so, what was I getting at? I did want to do one point when we talked about like our elections and Trump, and like the Republican Trump being like the face of the Republicans right now. What's interesting to me is, in Canada, and I'm not saying we should adopt the Canadian system, but in Canada, you vote for the party, like you vote for your minister of parliament, and whoever, I don't know if it's like this in England, but whoever, whichever party has the most votes, their leader of the party becomes the prime minister.
Yeah.
So they can change leaders. And I've seen that. I think that I saw that once when I was a kid. They changed leaders, and then there's a new prime minister. So it's the party that basically heads the government, rather than just one. You're not voting for one person. There is a downfall to that, though, because I do actually like the two-party system. I don't know if you do, because in Canada I found that the liberal votes were spread among, like, honestly, like 15 different liberal parties. And the conservative vote, there was just like one conservative party, and they kept it that way. And then they ended up always having a majority.
Yeah.
And so that I think was a little bit of their downfall. But
that's what happens in the UK too. It's exactly the same thing. It's like people who have values where they prioritize, like, they really care deeply about having the world work in the best way that it can. They tend to be very precise about the ideologies that they commit to. So you end up with 5 or 6 different parties that are everything between center left and extreme left, because nobody wants to give an inch because they care so deeply about their beliefs. And then everybody who doesn't really give that much of a shit, but is just kind of happy with the way things are, just goes into this like broad conservative bracket, where they have a big tent philosophy where anybody is welcome, because they don't have that many guiding principles. And then it becomes everybody who cares really deeply, so to the point where they're so specific in what they think is appropriate, versus everybody who doesn't really care that much and is willing to basically just align with everybody, with anybody, in order to keep things the way that they are. And that's what happens in the UK. You have the Conservative Party, who have no real driving policies other than keep our donors happy. And then you have Labour, who have historically been guided by, or they've been everywhere from centre left through to quite far left, and they've had a lot of very principled leaders, but they've never been good enough at building coalitions with the other parties that exist in the multi-party system that they've been able to actually make, at least in recent years, they haven't been able to make a dent in the Conservative Party. The Conservatives have had power for 10 years now, have won 4 elections in that time, despite the fact that there are just innumerable failures of Conservative government, including allowing fucking Brexit to happen, which is the biggest disaster that's happened to the country in God knows how long. And so because the Conservatives are just this big mass of like, everybody mostly just cares about themselves, they're fine with just one big party that encompasses everybody from like some really racist people to some people who just want the guys in the bankers in London to make a bit more cash, and like they're all together and they're aligned with each other because all they want is to stop anybody from the left getting any kind of power whatsoever. And then everybody on the left is fighting with each other about the most minute policy issues, and they can't get anything done because, you know, they align on 80% of issues, but they can't agree on 20%. And so they're all like, fuck you, I'm not voting for you, you know, and it's so frustrating.
It sounds about right. Are you going to hate me if you're going to hate me if I say that I really liked Margaret Thatcher just as a woman, as a woman? She was like super powerful leader, just didn't take shit from any men. I
can certainly understand why someone would respect her in that sense.
But she did not. So as she did not handle herself like a Trump, you know, she was still fairly coherent.
Oh yeah. I mean, she was a leader. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Like she certainly was, she was a strong female leader, but she also fucking ruined certain parts of the UK. Like she like there was a time, I don't know how familiar you are with the details of stuff that she did, but like there was a time where there was the city of Liverpool in the UK is it's in the north. It's a very working class town. It has a reputation for being a town that has at various times had really high unemployment and a lot of social unrest at times due to that. I think it was in the 80s in particular, when she was prime minister, it was a real kind of hotbed of trouble, kind of in the same way that somewhere like Detroit or Chicago might be characterized in that way in the US. And at this time, there was a lot of debate over like, what do we do? Like, what kind of social welfare initiatives are we going to put in place that are going to kind of rescue this city from all the problems that it's going through? And as prime minister, her approach to this, or the approach that she kind of favored, was like, let's just let the city die. Let's just like leave it alone. And the 800,000 million people or whatever that live there, she was like, if they're not going to help themselves, we're not going to help them. And so the thing that Thatcher did that was so damaging for the UK is there's a generation of people now, my parents' generation mostly, who were all on board with that Thatcher philosophy, the philosophy of like, if there's problems going on in inner cities, if there's problems that relate to communities, like communities of color, immigrants, things like that, if there's problems that relate to people going through poverty, unemployment, all of that, the philosophy was basically, fuck those people, they're on their own. And that was what filtered down into that whole generation. And it was so tough.
I will tell you that I minimally learned about Margaret Thatcher in school. Because we went over the British government system and previous prime ministers and stuff, because we very much mirrored it, but I didn't dive into the deep end on that one. So don't stab me at the World Series of Poker.
Oh no, I'm not. I think like, if I look at it through my own lens, I'm sure that there's leaders from other countries that I look at and I'm like, oh, this guy seems like he was probably a pretty good leader for a country. And if I found out about their actual policies, there'd probably be millions of people that could tell me how terrible they were. So.
And for me, it feels like So someone like Margaret Thatcher, as me as like a young woman, looked at her and a few video clips and read a few things about her. I was like, oh, wow, she seemed like a bright woman. But like Trump is obviously an idiot, says the stupidest shit, and it's so obvious and apparent, and he still has people voting for him. You know, I went into a meeting at work, and like one of the I can't even like get into detail about it, but that one of like the head people of our organization's like, well, fuck, Trump's still fucking president today. Like he was so pissed. And it's just like everyone, anyone with a brain is just like, how the fuck is this happening?
And the thing that seems the most evident to me is how crazy it is that we really, there's two different worlds that exist now. There's the world of people who are very up to date and informed about all the terrible stuff Trump does, because we read reliable news sources that are willing to report when he does something that is completely illegal or unconstitutional, or, you know, we actually pay attention to the reality of what's going on, and we can see that this guy is quite transparently not prepared to be in charge of a major country. And then there's the other reality, which is people who only get their news from Fox News and who are not even like, they think we're all completely insane because they literally do believe that everything that's reported about Trump is some kind of conspiracy. And the funny part about this for me is that in itself is like this weird macro level manifestation of Trump's own narcissism, in that he genuinely believes people are out to get him. Like he really thinks that everybody is so intent on bringing him down that they're willing to just like, you know, create all these conspiracies that completely fuck with the systems of American democracy because they hate this specific guy. He can't not see things through that lens. And then everybody around him now is so, for some reason, subservient to him that they're willing to buy into this idea. They're willing to go out there on his behalf and say, yes, it's all a hoax. It's all a conspiracy. It's crazy.
He only keeps people around. He's fired any logical person. Anyone who defies him, he fires them. So of course, that's what his camp is. Just a bunch of yes people.
Exactly.
And it's funny because I feel like this year it's been really, or this past year, I should say, towards the end of last year, it's been unreal to me how narcissism, the clear characteristics of narcissism are like almost cookie cutter. Like Mike Postle is like that. Trump is 100%. Like that. Like it's so it's so I've dated a narcissist, and I'm just like, now I'm on the outside and I'm like, oh my God, that was so obvious.
Believe me, my wife's ex-husband is in that category too. And I hear the stories of how he used to behave. And I'm like, that is first of all, I'm looking at that and like, how can anyone behave that way? And second of all, it's the same personality for every person who's in that category.
For all of them.
They are the same person. And it's so weird how that develops, but it's so true. I can look at Trump, and the reason I hate him so much is because I look at him and I see my wife's ex-husband, and I see every other guy that I've known who's in that same category, who I know would not hesitate to do horrible things to people for their own benefit, because I know that personality is what it is. And if it's present in somebody, there's no getting rid of it. There's no like reforming them, because they're psychologically incapable of it. And that's what Trump has. And if you put a guy like that in charge of the country, the situation that we're in now is the reason he's talking about delaying the election isn't just because he's losing. I mean, I know it's a big topic, just considering it's just come up today, but it's not just because he's losing. It's because he's deathly afraid of what happens when he loses. And this is the thing that I've been saying for quite a long time that I don't think enough people buy into yet. The idea that it's quite clear that Trump hates being president. It's quite clear that he's not having any fun this last 4 years. He's not getting anything done. He doesn't care about the well-being of the American people.
Right.
So why doesn't he just say, I'm not going to run for a second term, if he is so stressed out by all of this and he's like tearing his hair out to the point where he's having the worst time of his life this 4 years? The reason is because whether we have the full information about what crimes he may or may not have committed or not, he himself clearly feels like he has to win this election. He has to stay president. And now what's happening is he recognizes he's losing. He recognizes he's down 10 or so points in the polls. He recognizes that the tide is turning against him because there's 150,000 deaths on his resume. And that's what scares me. Not just the idea that he is willing to do everything to win an election, but this is a guy who, for probably reasons we don't yet fully know about, is absolutely deathly afraid of losing this election.
So do you think Biden, if he just stays quiet, he can just easily win this?
Yeah,
or
I do. I have very high confidence that Biden will win. I think that I for sure think Trump is going to try to cheat in all kinds of ways. They're already fucking with mail-in voting. They're already trying to like fuck over the post office. There's all kinds of things that they've been doing for years. They've been staffing different government departments with incompetent people or yes men, like you say, in order to make sure that this could happen. Bill Barr quite clearly has no interest in actually having a fair election, and is pretty much on record as saying that he basically believes the president should be able to do whatever the hell he wants with no accountability. So they are going to cheat, but the question is, how well are the mechanisms of government going to protect us from that? And I think at this point, I have a reasonable degree of faith that they will protect us fairly well, because the states themselves, I think, have enough. I think that the fact that we have House, Senate, presidential elections going on at the same time is going to mean that, let's say Trump cheats and wins the presidential election. Well, he's not going to be able to cheat and win, all the Senate elections. And there's a very good chance that the Democrats take the Senate. And if that happens, it doesn't even matter, because as soon as the Democrats take the Senate, he's fucked. Like he can't do anything. He's going to be investigated to death for 4 years and probably impeached again and removed as soon as all the actual evidence of what he does on a regular basis is going to come out. So,
are you talking about evidence outside of Epstein type stuff? Are you talking about evidence while he's the president? I
mean, there's so much evidence, right? There's tax returns. There's the Epstein stuff. There's the Ukraine stuff.
I'm just wondering if you're referencing that what he's done during his time as president is going to impeach him, or if they can use his time with Epstein or any of the other stuff to impeach him.
I would imagine that anything that he did before he was president will mostly be used against him in an electoral sense, as opposed to an impeachment sense. But I for sure believe that there's like probably 20 other things he's done during his presidency that he could be impeached for. Not to mention the Mueller investigation said that he obstructed justice like 10 times, right? And Nixon got impeached for that. So like if you look at what a Democratic Senate would do to him right now, as opposed to a Republican Senate, if you look at like even let's say it was a Republican Senate led by Mitt Romney instead of led by Mitch McConnell. You think about what would be happening now in that circumstance. If Mitt Romney was in charge of the GOP, then you might have actually seen them vote to remove him.
Yeah.
Back in January. I mean, and it's as crazy as it sounds. Like it was 6.5 months ago, they were voting on whether to keep this guy as president. And then a month later, the pandemic hits. And now where would we be if they had just said, you know what? This guy quite clearly did try to get Ukraine to rig the election for him. And we now have evidence that he quite clearly tried to get China to do it as well. And who knows what happened with Russia back in 2016? Who knows what's happened with any number of other countries that he's been trying to get to do him favors over the past few years. And all that would come out if the Republicans hadn't prevented literally anybody who actually knew the facts from testifying at the impeachment trial. So the reality of what would be happening to him now, and to pretty much everybody around him, if the Democrats were in charge of the Senate, has got to be pretty scary for them. And the fact that even if they rig the presidential election in some fashion, even if they prevent enough mail-in voting to take some of the swing states, they won't be able to rig all the Senate races and all the House races. The Democrats are very likely to keep the House. All of that gives me enough confidence that I think we're gonna stave off disaster, even if he wins the election. But the thing that I'm afraid of is the power that Trump has over his supporters and what he's going to be able to convince them to believe, even if even if he is removed from power. So let's say he loses the election, Biden's president, 21st of January 2021. From that day onwards, maybe there's going to be 35% of the country that believes he was wrongfully removed from power. And what does that do? You know, what do we do when, 60% of people in the South believe that Trump should still be president and he's not? And what happens then? We don't have any idea. And that's the scary part for me.
Well, I mean, we had to fuck them up when they wanted to keep their slaves. So maybe we should fuck them up again.
Maybe.
I'm just saying. I mean, like, what are you going to do? Like,
I mean, this is the funny part for me as well. Like, because it's always been
fucking really bad comments for that, but
that's fine. I mean, whatever. We're immigrants. We can just move home if it gets too bad. But the thing that's crazy for me, right, is that there's always been this thing from the South of like feeling like there's this history of the strength of that region, and like this sense of like, we're going to secede, we should have our own country and all that stuff. If you look at where the problems exist in this country, if you look at where like literacy rates are really low, child mortality is really low, like all different aspects in which you judge the efficacy of a country really in terms of how it's taking care of its citizens or of a state, the South has a lot of problems. And you would think that if people cared about the welfare of people in the South, they would embrace the idea of the union, because they would want to say, hey, California, you clearly are getting things pretty right because you're the sixth largest economy on the planet, even including countries. Hey, maybe we should do things a bit more similarly to how you do it, instead of demonizing you as this hellhole, which somehow also coincidentally includes all the biggest tech companies on the planet and, you know, has higher GDP than almost the entire rest of the US. It's like the idea that all the places in the US that everybody else worldwide looks at as symbols of what is good about America, like cities like New York City, cities like San Francisco, cities like LA, that's what people think of when they think of America. They don't think of some town in Alabama, but the people in the towns in Alabama, they don't have any aspirations to ever be like what's going on in California. And yet, you know, there's such a disconnect there for me. I don't get why people aren't willing to say, look, there's a lot of good parts of the US, so let's do that. That just baffles me.
Well, I also think that Americans to me seem like they want to be one thing or the other. Like they want everything to be mutually exclusive. You're either a pie or a cake person. You're either this team or that team. They want to separate themselves. So if you're not Californian, you're this. And so they don't, it's like a thing here. It's really weird when I go places. Do you like this or that? I'm like, I like both. I can be both.
Exactly. It's contrarianism, you know,
it is,
way it's a country founded on contrarianism, because it's literally a country founded by people that said, we don't want to be British anymore. We want to be something different. We want to be not this. And the American ideal was founded on, we are not this other thing. And when you found a country based on what you're not instead of what you are, or instead of the things that you have in common, then that permeates across decades, across several centuries now. And you get this mentality where everybody, you know, culturally defines themselves by what they are opposed to, what they're in opposition to. You know, it's not that they have a strong sense of what they are. It's that I'm not this. Well, I'm opposed to this.
Okay, so
you know,
so as humans though, like if you've sapiens dived into this, where we as primates before we became Homo sapiens we formed groups, but at the most, because we're social beings and we like to connect with people and become friends, the most our groups could grow was 150 primates.
Right. Is that Dunbar's number or something like that? Is that what it's called?
Sorry?
Is it called like Dunbar's number or something? That the number of relationships we can hold?
I can't remember what the exact, it was like, I actually looked at my Snapchat. I read it a year ago and I still haven't completely finished it. It's a little dry, but I really learned a lot. And so we would separate after 150, but what started bringing us together in larger groups was, rather than all knowing each other, we used religion. we all
Mhm.
believed in the same thing. And so,
Yeah.
oh, we don't know each other, but we have this belief in the same
Mhm.
thing. And it's almost like tribal in a way.
Yeah.
And we still practice that a lot. So we all believe in this idea. We're all going to form together, and we're from here, and we believe in this, and you're going to believe in
Mhm.
it too. And if you don't, you're not one of us. And that's
Yeah.
how it is.
Right. And I think that the funny part is that you can apply that to modern America in a lot of ways. And you can say, like, the reason people like you and I like living here, and the reason why immigrants are attracted to move here, is because there are a lot of ideals about what America is actually supposed to represent that are really attractive to people who immigrate here, right? And then the problem is that you have that group of people, and a lot of it's in the South, but it's in other areas too, who they don't define themselves, or they don't define their concept of what it is to be American according to what we all have in common, this belief in things like democracy and freedom and stuff like that. They define it by what we're not. So they define it like we're not these other countries. We're not like those other countries.
Yeah.
But when you have that, when the focal point is what you're not, then all of a sudden the group becomes smaller and smaller, because as society becomes more and more diverse, as the boundaries between certain things get more blurred. So, as you go from like we're Americans because we're not British, to we're Americans not just because we're not British, but because we're not any of these other also European countries that immigrants come from. Like, we're Americans now. When you define yourself as like, we're not this and we're not this and we're not this other thing and we're also not this other thing, well, now your set of like criteria that being American follows is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So the group of people that you're including in your definition of who's American and who's not gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which is how you get to this point where now there are a lot of people in this country whose definition of who is a quote unquote real American is you're white, you're Christian, you're conservative, and you believe in all these other different sets of things that differentiate yourself from everybody who's not a part of that very specific group. Instead of, if you flip that on its head, the idea can be as simple as, you're part of our group if you want to be an American. If you want to move here, if you're an immigrant who wants to come to America and believe in all these things, we welcome that. Like, we welcome people who believe in the same stuff. But when it's opposition, we welcome people who are not all this other stuff. You restrict yourself to this very small group. And I think that's what's happened when I talked earlier about like the ideology that's kind of developed, or this narrative about the history of America. What's happened is that narrative of we're a country born out of rebellion and things like that over time has become this thing where the concept of who counts as American gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And now you've got people who really, if you ask them deep down, their belief is that really only about a third of people in this country actually count as real Americans, because anybody who's Black, anybody who's Hispanic, whatever else, there's some element of that doesn't fit their concept of what an American actually is. But for the majority of people who have some kind of immigrant background or who are immigrants, that concept of what it is to be American is very tied to that immigrant status. And so for us, and for probably many other people, it's an inclusive idea of like, we all come from this kind of background of like, we've got family members from all over, and we all have some kind of point in our family history when we just kind of moved here because we like the idea of it. So let's celebrate that aspect instead of trying to define ourselves according to like this increasingly small group that we want to be a part of,
Yeah.
That was a long explanation. I'm sorry.
No, I like it. I think you're brilliant. I love talking to you.
You.
And I feel like I don't have all night unless you're down to stay up till 5 a.m. But I have like a list of things that I wanted to talk to you.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we've gone through a lot of political stuff. I think we've both gotten stuff off.
I mean, we can still stay political. I actually wouldn't mind getting your thoughts on Joe Biden, and and we don't have to go like for too long about Joe Biden, but I'm just curious because I think I don't belong to a political party, and I'd like to be objective when I'm looking at stuff. And Joe Biden as a person kind of worries me a little bit too. Of course, I'd rather have him than Trump. But do you think that some of this negative stuff we see about Joe Biden is just like a campaign effort? Do you think like he has cognitive issues or?
I think there's some evidence that he's not what he was, for sure. Yeah. But I think that, first of all, I think having spent a reasonable amount of time looking into the assault allegations that went around about him and things like that, that was a right-wing campaign. That was a smear campaign, for sure.
Yeah, I looked into that too. I agree.
Yeah. So I don't believe that, for example, when he was being vetted to be vice president for Obama, I don't believe they just somehow missed that. That was a smear campaign that was run in recent years. I think beyond that, in terms of his politics, I think that he's always been someone who the principles in terms of what he stands for on a personal level are principles that I think everybody should be able to get behind. As far as a political level, I think he has a bit of a sort of checkered history to a degree. But I think if you look at the platform that he's running on, when you consider that he's worked closely with Bernie Sanders, he's worked with a lot of different people from across the spectrum of Democratic Party ideologies, the platform on which he's running should be one that everybody in the Democratic Party, or everybody who is even vaguely willing to vote for a Democratic candidate, everybody who's not a Trump supporter, basically, should be able to find something in that platform that they can look at and say, I support this, this is good, and I trust the guy who's in charge to, at the very least, get out of the way of the people who are actually putting the policies in place.
So let me ask you real quick. Sorry. Sure. When you said a political checkered past, I'm just curious what you think, because I feel like in I think all over the world, or mostly I'm seeing in America, people are like, oh yeah, well, he didn't believe this 5 years ago and now he does. And I'm like, we should actually be looking at politicians who are changing their minds and things, and we should be celebrating that. No one wants to be, I would be scared of a politician who hasn't changed anything or their minds on anything in 30, 40 years, because that shows me that they don't have critical thinking skills. You should be changing it. You should be wrong every once in a while.
Yeah,
is that what you mean?
Sure. Yeah, for the most part it is. Yeah, I think saying he has a checkered past is sort of throwing a bone a little bit to people who believe that he's not progressive enough, I guess, in that he's had some votes that he's cast on certain issues that were not particularly progressive. The Obama administration had policies particularly regarding how the US conducted the war in the Middle East and things like that a lot of people disagreed with. And there's no getting away from the fact that Biden participated in, a mixed bag of political outcomes while he was in a position of responsibility, either in the Senate, in his vice presidency. There's no getting away from that. But in terms of, do I believe this man has the best interests of the American people at heart? Absolutely. I for sure trust that he is a person of high integrity in that regard, and that he actually genuinely wants the best for people. And I think in large part, a lot of people struggle with politics simply because there's a cynicism that they believe that no politician truly actually does care that much about the interests of people, and they believe that politicians are really mostly out for themselves. And I think that there are certain people to whom that applies, but there are a lot of people, mostly people who are Democrats, but I do believe people like Mitt Romney are in that category too, where there are people of principle that run for political positions because they do believe they can do something to make a difference in people's lives. And I think Joe Biden is somebody that, do I agree with everything he's ever done? No, but if I had a vote, would I be proud to vote for him instead of voting for Trump? Absolutely.
At this point, given everything that Trump's said and done and tweeted, do you think you could lose a friendship over someone who votes for Trump in November?
Yeah, I would for sure. I would, if someone I knew was voting for Trump, I would, it's such an egregious thing that it would cause me to reconsider everything that I thought was true about that person, in the sense that I would base a friendship with someone on what I think this person's values are, not just like what interests do we have in common, but do I think this person has the same priorities as me in life? And if you are still considering voting for Trump at this point, one of two things is true. Either you're not looking at the evidence in a way that shows that you actually care about doing your homework on who you're voting for, or you believe that Trump represents your values better than Joe Biden. And either one of those two things, if you're so uninterested in the welfare of society as a whole that you don't really care that much one way or the other to do your homework about a candidate, or if you literally think that Trump is actually the best candidate, either of those two things is a clear sign to me that someone just doesn't have the values that would match up with me being able to be friends with this person. But to be honest, I don't have anybody in my life really right now that I think would be in the group of people who would be thinking about voting for Trump right now. Obviously, I have a lot of friends who are back at home in the UK and who don't get a vote anyway, but I don't think there's a single person in the UK who would vote for Trump. So I don't think that's really an issue.
I know people in my family who love Trump and send me COVID home cure links on Facebook.
Wow.
And I don't do that. Yeah, it's kind of, so I haven't been on Facebook in a while, but that I just won't go on Facebook because it's become a toxic waste dump for those people.
I quit Facebook like 3 years ago, and I love the fact that I did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really quit but my account hasn't been updated in like 4 years.